do anything in the long run. I think here, when we look into it further, we know that the international education tends to be known for a particular approach which is being followed by the international policy making circles and also by the successful countries who tend to be our kind of role models. I think, but in economic circles, we see that it tends to be rather seen in a very narrow way, that as if it is a response to the globalization process and nothing to do with the so-called country's own felt needs in the context of ensuring fairness and equity to all the citizens, which is a part of our India's constitutional framework. And and then in that context, we find that while internationalization of education tend to represent to a very great extent globalized learning, but in our own context, we find the international education tends to be rather approached through a very short-sighted angle, which means all about international recruitment of students and internationalization of our own institutions, but not to do something very technically. But my paper also tends to distinguish the international education as it is being understood from what is the need of the hour for a poor country like India, for a poor and developing country like India, that it is educational internationalization. And when you contrast the both the educational international and internationalization of education, we find that education internationalization tends to emphasize the core aspects of the society which are calling for attention to be strengthened in terms of enhancing the ability of teaching and learning, so as to be involved in the international culture and to enhance our own students' employability and also something what you call is job eligibility. But we find that in the current phase of globalization, as we see, while international education tends to be and India has borrowed this term not really having been motivated by our own considerations, rather by the considerations of international economy, and as we say in our own discipline, by the so-called need of the global capitals. And the global capitals are the one, as we see, that after having got the market saturated with their own products, now education is being treated as a product and much as a commodity, and which they have been emphasizing on reaching of this so-called westernized international education, as they called it, to the far reach corners of the world, and where probably the third world countries are now going to be greatly affected. I think the danger is that instead of educational internationalization, they tend to follow international education, where the international education tends to be treated as a process of commercializing research and education, and primarily international competition for recruitment of foreign students from better off countries. I think this tends to be almost setting off a kind of a, as we call it, some kind of a chase for foreign students coming from better off countries, and if we don't get students from Europe, and which is what we know, they come to India in a very lesser number, and we tend to rather look for other unexplored market like in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the idea is probably for going for such kind of internationalization of our own higher education, we will be able to build an international reputation, we'll be able to secure our own national pride, we'll also probably be able to develop various international branches. But when you contrast this model with the real model that should be followed in the context of international education, is that there should be international of the curriculum. There should be also emphasis on research and educational partnership between the institutions, both at the regional level and also at the international level. But then we find that the kind of rationals normally which are followed at the international level, which tend to talk about, which tend to have ideological rationale, or it's an economical rationale, or it could be educationalism or educational level. These rationals are often voiced for promoting international education, but in our own case we find that the kind of approach that has followed our own international education tend to be more based on instrumentalist model rather than what we call it some kind of educational model. I think why we call it that it has been instrumentalist model, simply because we find that the preparation from our own countryside, by our own decision makers, by our own policy makers, tend to be rather very shoddy. It seems that most of the attempts are half-baked, and when you look into our own existing, I saw in the opening session there was a kind of a reference to IITs and not to central universities. I was wondering that how can Dr. Mittal talk of the IITs and not of the central universities when she was in UGC. The idea is that probably IITs are success stories simply because IITs tend to be based on the Ford model, and central universities more or less tend to be based on the so-called Indian model of education, where the central universities tend to be suffering from various kind of problems and IITs tend to be boosting. Nonetheless, since centrally and India has also gone on a kind of a wild goose chase spree of setting up something like 42 central universities. They are also adding more and more central universities, and that shows as to how the kind of preparation for our own national education and also for international education tends to be rather reflecting some kind of a half-baked attempt. And why we call it half-baked attempt? Simply because we find that when we tend to select some kind of appropriate strategies which will require organizational reforms, which will require systemic reforms, which will also require putting in place the academic strategies or academic reforms that we talk about in terms of academic programs, in terms of research and scholarly contributions, in terms of external relations, where we could be able to push our own domestic and extracurricular activities. We find that they seem to be not at all aided by the organizational structure which are in place in the name of centrally funded higher educational institutions. I think and here we find that when you look into the present day university level, if you at all feel the international education tend to be rather appearing to be very, very scary to the academicians and to the youth. I think Dr. Dev was talking about youth, and you find that the youth seem to be rather very scared of international education simply because our organizational structure tends to be so moribund that it doesn't seem to be incorporating the need for improved governance within the institutions, and the organizational structure seems to be rather very faulty. I think we also find that within our own organizational level structure of higher education, we find that the three C's which are of great importance, that is coordination, communication, cooperation, tend to be rather very, very absent. And I think somewhere in the era of present day globalization, we tend to be talking about a well calibrated approach. I think when you look into the higher education sector here, one can see that there seems to be almost an absence of well calibrated approach, and there seems to be a kind of a competition amongst the educationists who tend to boost, who tend to be standing up for international education only to be seen on the side of the government and not to be seen on the side of the people who are going to be the real sufferers in terms of lack of equity and affordability as far as their own educational attainment is concerned. I think when you talk of the institutions, we also have to remember that the international education is being pursued by the government even in the context of the absence of adequate financial support to the higher education institutions, and merely the policy pronouncements which are being made by the government by its various agencies tend to appear rather empty, simply because it doesn't really promise any kind of a financial support to the institution to implement those policies, and simply probably the policymakers tend to have there in mind that the policies should be merely announced for the consumption of the people and not to be at all implemented in the real sense of the term. I think when the Indian government tends to be emphasizing on international education, we all know that international education probably doesn't have to be only one way. I think the Indian government is trying to invite more and more foreign students inside. We know that when the UGC tend to have floated the proposal that as to how many foreign universities will be able to open up their own campuses in India, there was a very, very meager response, and merely 11 universities, and which are not so well reputed. They are not Harvard, they are not Princeton, they are not the other universities of repute who wanted to open up their campus, because they pointed out that there are some kind of a regulation vacuum which will probably make their functioning rather not very good, and which may also spoil their reputation if they tend to offer such set up their own campuses in India to offer higher education. So I think the best way for Indian government will be probably to follow internationalization by way of trying to bring about internationalization in the home curriculum, in the home institutions, by providing on-campus global learning environment, and not really trying to push the kind of Western model which tends to be talked about by the so-called global capitalists. And here I think some way or the other, when you talk of internationalization, we find that the Anglo-American model, which is now being which appears to be very faulty in the context of the developing countries of the world, the poorer countries of the world. We find that the American Anglo-American experience has been almost based on the commodification and commercialization of post-secondary higher education. And I think when you examine our own Indian policy of international education, we find that the same value is probably inherent in our own policies, rather than trying to bring about any kind of a change at the societal level or at the level of internationalization of curriculum. I think when you talk about the societal level, if that could be the best way to push internationalization, it would probably involve that the institutions, the existing centrally funded and also state funded higher education institutions need to develop synergy for mutual interaction, and also they must try to provide for the various kind of a collaboration between our own students with international students, which will enhance the employability. But then we find that that international education tend to be rather little positive, in the sense that it tends to have created some kind of awareness in the minds of the Indians, both the educated and the uneducated Indians, as to how much the international curriculum tend to be of greater importance than merely pushing the international education in terms of sending our own students abroad. I think we read in the newspaper that Indian students are probably the second largest or largest in UK. They are second largest in USA, and they seem to be also present in almost as many countries as they are. But when you look into their job prospects, we find that as many Indians are not employed in the Western countries' sectors of economy and society, rather than compared with the number of students those who go abroad. And we now saw as to how the unreforming of our own domestic national education sector tends to be putting people to dangers, where the Ukraine example shows as to how the students not having been able to get seats in the medical and technical institutions within our own country tend to incur high expenditure, and to go to foreign countries where they are not only assured of quality education, they tend to be are also put to economic drain. I think that we should also understand that how the internationalization of educational internationalization, which has not been followed within the country, tend to be almost reflecting the drain theory, which was talked about by Lala Lajpat Rai during the days of colonialism, and also now we can see that the same sector is now being followed. The same policy is now contributing to the drain of our so-called national wealth, where the money tends to be embellishing and enriching the Western economy rather than own economy. I think in this context we need to know that the new Western policy, which has been talked about in a great number, in a great deal of enthusiasm, we know that NEP tends to be talking of too many things, where they seem to be talking about as to how the national education, the NEP will be the end all of the country's woes, and how the NEP will be bringing about a new era. It will transform the education sector. It will make India a knowledge superpower. It will also provide a kind of a vibrant environment for Indian youth learning and probably employability in the days to come. But it's one thing that's positive about is that it tends to add something like 35 millions of seats in the India's education institutions. I think this should have been the first goal before India tends to harp on the so-called international education, and the present policy of environment shows that probably the achievement of the so-called noble goals within quote, which have been enunciated by the news policy, would be very, very difficult to be achieved, simply because that there is almost a failure on the part of the government to mobilize the so-called much needed resources in order to both energize the higher education institutions and also to energize the so-called student community. I think here if you talk about the international education, the choice is probably we can understand that since economically it has become almost unaffordable to sort of attain the goal of India being a knowledge superpower. The only way open to India is probably to seek for international assistance. But we all know that international assistance in the present day geopolitical environment is not so easy to come. So it finally necessitates that India will have to bring about the necessary reforms within its own domestic sectors, and India will have to also work very hard to overcome the various challenges which it tends to have come up with in the context of the need for, need for, as we call it, building a just and a fair society, the various obstacles which tend to be present within the political and social system. I think some of the obstacles that we have identified in the context of the implementation of the so-called in so-called policies for the sake of fairness and just society within our country, the India will have to first try to bring about the reforms which it tends to be suffering from what is known as the institutional challenges. I think in the institutional challenges, I think the suitable institutions will have to be empowered by the government to carry on the to be tasked with the responsibility of implementing the government policies, which will probably help the country more rather than merely by going out some kind of a blank pronouncements. I think the second obstacle that we know India tends to be a
Sorry, Dr. Mahapatra, can I please request you to wrap up?
Yeah, ma'am, we are wrapping up. We are wrapping up just because, we are wrapping up the challenges that are there. That tends to be, India has to work on the institutional challenges, the political challenges, where we find there is a lack of consensus amongst the political parties as to what should be the way that the internationalization of education should be followed by the country, and also there is also a kind of ideological divide which again needs onboarding of all political elements together on any kind of a policy framework that India tends to embark upon, including in the NEP. We also find that there has to be some kind of a performance link between the policies and also the expected implementation. I think the other thing that we talk about is that India should also have to get rid of the habit of being a halting state. Once a policy has been pronounced and going to be implemented, India has to probably mobilize all the required resources in order to see that the policy tends to yield its benefit. I think the other one is that for the global community, we find that the global community, instead of pushing the so-called global capital to reach all the remotest corner of the poor countries, including India, they have to probably follow some kind of a philanthropic model where any kind of investment that they tend to make in the area of education should be rather influenced by the so-called moral values of building up a fair, just and to say, if you call it gender equal society, rather than result in any kind of a divide that seems to be arising out of such policy pursuits. And at the end, we also need to understand that the better world requires better education for all, and that is what will be to the benefit of the whole mankind rather than to any particular country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahapatra. Another reminder to the audience to pose their questions in the chat, so we can take the discussion forward over there. Now, since we are running out of time a little bit, I would like to hand over directly to Dr. Pankaj Kumar Gupta and to Dr. Prabhat Mittal for their presentation. Over to you.